My boyfriend cheated with my best friend. At their wedding, they mocked me, so I exposed them. How does it feel to be betrayed by the two people you trusted most? Lena always believed that true love was something you worked for, something you nurtured like a delicate flower, something that would bloom over time. She'd always been a romantic, idealistic in her views about relationships. So when she met Dan, a charming, confident man who swept her off her feet, she thought she had found the one, the person she would spend the rest of her life with. Dan was everything Lena had ever wanted. He was loving, caring, and always made her feel like the center of his universe. They met during college, and their relationship quickly blossomed into something serious. Dan was her rock. He was the person who comforted her during tough times, celebrated her achievements, and supported her dreams. For the first time in her life, Lena felt completely understood and loved. But there was always something Lena didn't know, something lurking beneath the surface, a truth she would discover too late. It all started when Lena decided to take a weekend trip with her best friend, Emily. Emily had been with Lena through thick and thin. They'd known each other since high school, sharing secrets, dreams, and fears. Emily was the one Lena could count on no matter what, the person who knew every corner of her heart. But when Lena returned from her trip, she noticed that things between her and Emily had shifted. It wasn't immediately obvious. Small things at first, like how Emily would avoid eye contact or change the subject when Lena asked about her recent conversations with Dan. But soon enough, it became clear that something was wrong. One evening, as Lena sat in her apartment with her phone buzzing relentlessly, she finally confronted Emily. "What's going on between you and Dan?" Emily's face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak but then closed it again, as though the words were stuck in her throat. After a long pause, she finally admitted what Lena had dreaded to hear. "I'm sorry, Lena," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I never wanted it to happen, but I've been seeing Dan behind your back." The words hit Lena like a ton of bricks. Her knees gave way, and she stumbled back into the chair behind her, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't breathe. "How long?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. "A few months," Emily said, tears welling in her eyes. "It just happened. We didn't mean for it to go this far, but we're in love." Lena felt the world around her start to crumble. How could her best friend do this to her? How could Dan, the man she had trusted with everything, betray her in the worst way possible? The realization hit her like a gut punch, knocking the wind out of her. The wedding invitation arrived 2 weeks later. It was from Dan and Emily. They were getting married. Lena's heart sank when she saw the envelope. She felt her hands tremble as she opened it. There, in bold letters, was the announcement of their wedding, the day they would publicly declare their love for one another. Lena couldn't believe what she was reading. How could they get married after everything they'd done? How could Emily, the woman who had once been her closest friend, betray her in the most unforgivable way? How could Dan, the man she had imagined spending the rest of her life with, do this to her? But as painful as it was, Lena wasn't surprised. She knew deep down that they'd never felt guilty about their actions. They had moved on, as though their affair had never meant anything to her. The wedding day arrived, and Lena couldn't bring herself to stay away. She had to see it for herself. She needed to know just how far their betrayal went. And so, Lena put on her best dress, held her head high, and walked into the venue. As soon as she entered, she was greeted by the sight of Dan and Emily, standing at the altar, smiling and exchanging vows. The room seemed to fade away, and all Lena could hear was the sound of her own heart breaking. It was as if the world was mocking her. The two people who had meant everything to her were now standing together, exchanging promises of forever. Lena felt the weight of their lies crashing down on her, suffocating her in a way she had never experienced before. And then it happened. During the reception, as the newlyweds danced together, Emily and Dan took the opportunity to mock Lena in front of everyone. They laughed, their voices dripping with amusement as they made cruel jokes about her, as though her pain was some sort of entertainment. Lena's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She felt the heat rise in her chest, anger mixing with the overwhelming sadness she had been carrying for so long. They had crossed a line. They had humiliated her, and she wasn't going to stand for it any longer. It was time to expose them. Without a second thought, Lena walked to the front of the room, her voice steady but full of rage as she addressed the crowd. "You think this is funny?" she asked, her voice echoing through the hall. "You think it's funny to betray me like this?" To make me the punchline of your little joke. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Emily and Dan's faces drained of color as Lena continued. I'm not here to ruin your day, she said, her eyes locked on them. But I'm not going to let you mock me and think you can get away with it. I've been holding this in for too long. Lena pulled out her phone and showed the room the messages she had uncovered. Proof of the affair, proof of their lies. She could feel her pulse racing as she watched the reactions around her. The silence was deafening. Emily and Dan stood frozen, their smiles long gone. The crowd was in shock, whispers filling the air as everyone processed what had just happened. Lena had exposed them for who they truly were, and the humiliation on their faces was undeniable. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lena felt a sense of empowerment. She had taken control of her own story. She had exposed their lies and broken free from the chains they had tried to bind her with. The reception ended in chaos, and Lena left the venue that night feeling both broken and liberated. She had lost her boyfriend, her best friend, and her dream of the future they had promised. But in the end, she had gained something more important: her dignity and the power to move forward. The aftermath of the wedding was a whirlwind of emotions for Lena. As she left the venue that night, she felt numb, the weight of the betrayal still pressing on her chest like a heavy stone. The world seemed to have spun out of control, leaving her in a chaotic blur. She didn't know where to go, or even what to think. The sounds of the wedding, laughter, music, the clinking of glasses, now seemed so distant, as if they belonged to someone else's life. But there was no going back. She couldn't just erase the truth of what had happened. The affair, the lies, the mockery. It was all out in the open now. And though Lena felt a sense of satisfaction from exposing them, there was still the lingering pain of losing both Dan and Emily in the most cruel way imaginable. For days, Lena stayed in her apartment, trying to process everything. Her phone constantly buzzed, messages from people she knew, offering sympathy, advice, and even accusations. Some people were on her side, angry at Dan and Emily for their betrayal, while others tried to blame her for the public scene at the wedding. But Lena wasn't concerned about those voices. The only thing that mattered was the feeling of betrayal that still burned inside her. She couldn't stop thinking about the years she had spent with Dan. How everything had seemed perfect, how he had been her protector, her confidant. And now, in the span of a few months, it had all crumbled into dust. The trust she had placed in him had been shattered beyond repair. Emily's betrayal cut even deeper. It wasn't just that she had slept with Dan, it was the way she had stood by Lena's side, pretending to be her friend, all the while knowing that she was taking everything Lena valued. The two of them had shared everything: emotions, secrets, fears, and yet, Emily had chosen to destroy that bond. Lena replayed the moment over and over in her mind. The wedding, the laughter, and the look of smug satisfaction on Emily's face as they mocked her. What hurt most was the realization that Emily, the person who had once been her closest friend, had become a stranger. Weeks passed, and the world seemed to keep turning, as if nothing had happened. Lena tried to put on a brave face for those around her. She returned to work, began seeing her friends again, and slowly started rebuilding her life. But the scars from the betrayal were still fresh, and no matter how much she tried to bury the pain, it lingered, just beneath the surface. She began to avoid places where she might run into Dan or Emily. She deleted them from her social media, blocked their numbers, and avoided any mutual friends who might try to bring them up. Lena wanted nothing to do with the people who had caused her so much pain. But despite her efforts to move on, there were moments when the memories would creep back in. Quiet, uninvited thoughts of what could have been. The picture-perfect life she had imagined with Dan now seemed like a cruel joke. She had believed in their future together, believed that their love was real. But it had all been built on lies. One night, as Lena sat alone in her apartment, a text message from an unknown number flashed on her screen. Her heart skipped a beat, wondering if it was Dan or Emily, perhaps trying to reach out. But when she opened the message, it wasn't from either of them. Instead, it was from a woman she didn't recognize. Lena, I know you don't know me, but I think you should hear the truth. Lena felt a jolt of confusion. Who was this woman? What truth was she referring to? The message continued, I've been keeping something from you, something you need to know about Dan and Emily. I've been watching this all unfold from the outside, and I can't keep quiet any longer. They're not who you think they are. I think you deserve to know what really happened, and I'll be here if you want to talk. Lena stared at the screen, her mind racing. What was this woman talking about? She'd already been betrayed by Dan and Emily in the worst way possible. Was there more to the story? She didn't know what to think, but a part of her felt a strange sense of urgency. She needed answers. Maybe, just maybe, this could help her make sense of everything. The next day, Lena met the woman. Her name was Kate, and she was a colleague of Dan's. They had worked together at a marketing firm, though Lena had never met her before. Kate explained that she had known about the affair for months, but didn't feel like it was her place to get involved. However, after seeing how things had played out, especially the public humiliation Lena had suffered at the wedding, Kate felt compelled to speak up. "I didn't want to believe it at first," Kate admitted, her eyes filled with regret. "But Dan and Emily, they weren't just having an affair. They were planning something much more malicious. They were both using you. I know you're hurting, but I couldn't let them get away with it without telling you the truth." Lena felt a knot tighten in her stomach. What could be worse than what she already knew? Kate continued. "They were both manipulating you. Dan was using you to secure his place in Emily's life, and Emily, she was using both of you to get ahead in her career. They had no intention of being faithful to anyone. It was all a game to them." Lena was in shock. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Could everything she had believed about her relationship with Dan, and her friendship with Emily, have been a lie from the very start? Had it all been part of their twisted plot to get what they wanted? The revelation hit Lena like a tidal wave. For days, she couldn't stop thinking about what Kate had said. She had always known there were signs that things weren't quite right, but to hear that it had all been a deliberate scheme made her question everything. Her trust in people had been shattered beyond repair, and the foundation of her entire life had been built on lies. But this newfound knowledge gave Lena something else. A sense of clarity. She didn't need to seek revenge or expose them any further. They had already shown their true colors. What mattered now was that Lena was finally free. Free from the toxic relationship she had built with Dan, free from the lies Emily had spun. Lena took a deep breath and decided it was time to start over. She didn't need their approval or their validation anymore. She didn't need to cling to the past or continue to live in the shadow of their betrayal. It was time to take control of her own life, to rebuild herself from the ground up. As Lena walked away from the ruins of her past, she knew one thing for certain. She was stronger than she had ever been before. Lena stood at the edge of a new chapter in her life, but the road ahead wasn't as easy as it seemed. Although she had decided to let go of Dan and Emily, the truth of their betrayal lingered, like an open wound that would take time to heal. She had been devastated, yes, but now more than ever, Lena realized that her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And she wasn't going to let their actions define her future. For the first time in months, Lena woke up to a new sense of purpose. The days of crying herself to sleep and wondering where everything went wrong were behind her. She focused on herself, on her career, her personal growth, and her friendships that hadn't been tainted by betrayal. The people who truly cared for her were the ones who stayed close during her darkest moments, not the ones who wore masks of affection only to tear her down when she was at her most vulnerable. Lena's professional life began to flourish. Her work at the marketing firm, which had been a constant source of stress and distraction during her relationship with Dan, began to take on new significance. She poured her heart and energy into her projects, and her dedication didn't go unnoticed. Her boss, impressed by her newfound confidence and determination, recommended her for a big promotion, a position she had once thought was out of reach. As the months went by, Lena's personal growth took center stage. She began to explore new hobbies, things she had put off while focusing all her energy on Dan and Emily. She joined a book club, started yoga, and even began writing a blog about her journey of healing and self-discovery. Writing allowed her to process her emotions, and as she shared her experiences, she found an unexpected community of people who related to her struggles. But there was one final thing Lena had to face: confronting Dan and Emily. After everything that had happened, she knew she couldn't just let them disappear from her life without taking a stand. Lena wasn't looking for revenge, but she was determined to reclaim her power. She needed them to understand the depth of the pain they had caused, and that she would not allow herself to be their victim any longer. It was a quiet afternoon when Lena decided to meet with Dan and Emily, but this time, she was in control. She met them at a small cafe in the city, a place they used to frequent during their relationship. As soon as they walked in, Lena could see the unease in their eyes. They hadn't expected her to be this calm, this composed. She greeted them politely, though the tension in the air was palpable. "How are you?" Dan asked, his voice uncertain. Lena didn't respond to the pleasantries. She didn't need to pretend that everything was fine anymore. Instead, she said, I've learned a lot in the past few months. I've learned that I don't need your apologies or your excuses. What you did was wrong, and it doesn't just hurt, it changes everything. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Lena wasn't finished. I want you both to understand something. You may have taken something from me, but you will never have the power to take away my happiness or my future. I've moved on, and I don't need either of you in my life anymore. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Dan opened his mouth to speak, but Lena stopped him. I don't need to hear your excuses. I've heard them all already. And as for you, Emily, I once considered you my best friend. But now, I see who you really are. You used me, and you used my relationship with Dan for your own benefit. And I won't let that go unnoticed. For a moment, there was silence. Emily seemed to shrink under Lena's gaze, but Dan, surprisingly, didn't argue. He looked defeated, as if the realization that Lena had finally found her strength had hit him harder than anything else. Lena stood up to leave, but before she did, she turned to face them one last time. You two have your lives. And I have mine. But remember, everything you've done to me, it's a part of your story now. It's on you to live with it. As she walked out of the cafe, Lena felt a sense of peace wash over her. The weight she had carried for so long was finally lifting, and with every step she took away from that moment, she knew she was only moving towards something better. Months later, Lena had transformed. She had embraced the journey of self-love and self-care, and the scars from her past were now part of her strength. Her career was flourishing, and she had built a solid network of friends who valued her for who she truly was. Most importantly, she had rediscovered herself, something she had lost in the maze of her old relationship. Dan and Emily were a distant memory now. The pain of their betrayal had faded into the background, replaced by the bright possibilities of the future. Lena had taken back her power. She was no longer a victim, no longer defined by the actions of others. One evening, as Lena sat on her balcony watching the sunset, she felt a calmness settle over her soul. She had come so far, and the journey was far from over. Her heart was open to new possibilities, and she knew she was ready for whatever came next. She had survived the worst, and she had come out stronger than ever before. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer held power over her. Lena had learned to let go, to forgive herself, and to rise above the pain. And in doing so, she had discovered a resilience within her that she never knew existed. Her life, her happiness, her future, was in her hands. And no one could ever take that from her again.